Hello, welcome to lecture number 4, Ethics and Politics in Social Research. In this lecture, we are going to discuss the relation of both ethics and politics to social research. We start then with ethics. A very basic definition of ethics is that a set of principles that govern human behavior. So when we talk about research ethics, we are referring to the principles and the rules that should govern research behavior. Or to put it differently, how researchers should conduct their work when they come to design and implement a research project. There are very general key questions to this aspect, which are: is there harm to participants? Is there deception involved? And are any vested interest in funding the research? These are three very basic but comprehensive and important aspects of research ethics. In the following minutes, you are going to watch 3 different short documentaries on 3 different research projects that took place during the 20th century and became very important. Please watch this documentary and try to understand what are the problems in regard to the ways researchers conducted their research projects.
In July of 1972, the Washington Star newspaper broke the story about the controversial Tuskegee Institute syphilis experiment. For 40 years, from 1932 until 1972, the U.S. Public Health Service, in partnership with Tuskegee, secretly studied the effects of untreated syphilis in African American men in Alabama. 600 black men, 399 with syphilis and 201 without the disease, were induced to participate in the experiment. Nearly all of them were poorly educated, impoverished sharecroppers. In exchange for participating, they were promised free medical exams, hot meals, and a burial stipend. The men with syphilis were not told they were infected and were not treated, even after penicillin was discovered to be an effective cure for the disease in the 1940s. Over the course of the experiment, 128 participants died of syphilis or syphilis-related complications. In 1972, when the paper exposed the details, the experiment was still ongoing. It incited public outrage over the unethical treatment of the participants, which led to the experiment's termination that November. The following year, the NAACP filed suit on behalf of the survivors. The federal government settled the lawsuit for $10 million. It also agreed to provide survivors and their infected family members with free medical services.
When I learn of incidents such as the massacre of millions of men, women, and children perpetrated by the Nazis in World War II, how is it possible, I ask myself, that ordinary people, who are courteous and decent in everyday life, can act callously, inhumanely, without any limitations of conscience. Now, there are some studies in my discipline, social psychology, that seem to provide a clue to this question. The problem I wanted to study was a little different. It went a little bit further. It was the issue of authority. Under what conditions would a person obey authority who commanded actions that went against conscience? These are exactly the questions that I wanted to investigate at Yale University. It is May 1962. An experiment is being conducted in the Elegant Interaction Laboratory at Yale University. The subjects are 40 males between the ages of 20 and 50 residing in the greater New Haven area.
Psychologists have developed several theories to explain how people learn. One theory is that people learn things correctly whenever they get punished for making a mistake.
40 years later, Milgram's infamous experiment, obedience, is still taught in classrooms around the world.
All right, teacher, would you take the test and be seated in front of the shock generator, please, in the next room?
But the experiment was rigged.
The victim was an accomplice of the experiment. The victim, according to plan, provided many wrong answers. His verbal responses were standardized on tape, and each protest was coordinated to a particular voltage level on the shock generator. Now, as teacher, you were seated in front of this impressive-looking instrument, the shock generator. Its essential feature is a line of switches that goes from 15 volts to 450 volts, and a set of verbal designations that goes from slight shock to moderate shock, strong shock, very strong shock, intense shock, extreme intensity shock, and finally XXX, danger severe shock. Your job, the experimenter explains to you, is a word pair test. If he gets each answer correctly, fine, you move on to the next pair. But if he makes a mistake, you were instructed to give him an electric shock, starting with 15 volts, and you increase the shock one step on each error.
That is incorrect. This one will be 195 volts.
The learner was hidden from the teacher by a partition.
Dance.
Of course, this was all a simulation. Nothing was really happening. But the learner made very convincing sounds of pain as the shocks increased.
This will be at 3:30.
And Milgram found, surprisingly and rather horrifyingly, that the majority of people would actually go right to the very highest level if there was some pressure from a man in a white coat who said things like,
It's absolutely essential that you continue. Continue, please.
Let me out of here. My heart's bothering me.
Go on.
Let me out.
Responsible for it.
in fact, about 65% of the people who he studied, who were normal volunteers from the ordinary population, actually gave the maximum number of volts.
This man was one of those 65%.
This one will be 195 volts. The correct one.
Let me out of here.
Slow.
Let
Dance.
me out of here. My heart's bothering me. Let me out of here. You have no right to keep me here. Let me out. Let me out of here. Let me out.
Continue, please.
Let me out of here. My heart's bothering me. Let
Go
me
on.
out. Let me out.
Responsible for it. Red. That is incorrect. This will be at 3:30. The correct phrase is rich
Let me out of
boy.
here. Let me out of here. My heart's bothering me. Let me out, I tell you. Let me out of here. Let me out of here. You have no right to hold me
The
here.
next phrase is
Let me
fast.
out. Let me out. Let me out. Let me out of here. Let me out. Let
Bird,
me
car,
out.
train, plane.
Eventually, the learner pretended to be unconscious.
Continue, teacher.
That is incorrect. This will be 3:45. The correct answer is fast, bird.
What we learned from that experiment is that people will actually do an awful lot when they're put under pressure from authority figures. And the problem is, of course, that when we obey the unjust authority figure, the person who gives us immoral commands, then, of course, awful things can go wrong.
In 1971, Professor Philip Zimbardo and his colleagues conducted an experiment at Stanford University designed to look at how ordinary men might behave if given the role of guards and prisoners. Their research was groundbreaking at the time, but it also raised an enormous number of questions for social psychology. The subject matter, outcomes, and methods are all of continuing interest to contemporary researchers.
Zimbardo carried out his study in the aftermath of World War II, and there was a lot of interest and concern at that time about those events and how the events of the Second World War could have happened. Also at that time then, the aftermath of Vietnam, and again a lot of interest in the atrocities that took place in that event and the murder of many civilians by soldiers in that war. So there was a lot of interest amongst psychologists in how the thing could have happened and how ordinary people could have got drawn into those events.
He was very concerned with the impact of social roles and what they had on the way in which humans behave. And I think he was very concerned with trying to understand the impact of the social context. So I think in terms of his work, he was very much concerned with gearing his research around what happens to people when they take up particular social roles and when they become part of particular social groups.
At the beginning of this study, the prisoners were arrested at their homes by real police officers and were taken off to the local police station. Now, this was not something which they had signed up for, and they were surprised, understandably, by this event, and they asked the police officers what was the relationship between this event and their signing up for a psychology study. And the police officers refused to be drawn into this conversation. So this was a very unsettling way of starting the study. Zimbardo brought them to a mock-up of a prison, which he created in the basement of the psychology department at Stanford University. What he did then was to divide his group into prisoners, into guards. The guards had a guard's uniform, and they had sunglasses, and they had a stick, and the prisoners wore loose-fitting smocks and sandals. Now, the prisoners spent 24 hours a day in this mock prison, and the guards came and went doing shifts.
Part of what he was doing was observing what was going to take place in this particular context and how those roles as either prisoner or guard, how they shaped or sort of changed the way people behaved.
The guards now fell into their job. Some of them liked it, some of them disliked it, but it was a job that they did. They gave commands, and now what happened is the prisoners followed them.
You can give me the blankets and sleep on the bed and mattress. Or you can keep your blankets, and 416 will stay in another day.
They found ways to punish prisoners if they misbehaved.
Let's see if we can count backwards here. Let's try that out. 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Oh, that's bad. Hey, I don't want anybody laughing.
It was certainly the case that initially the prisoners did show some signs of disbelief and rebellion about what was happening.
This is unbelievable. They took our clothes.
Hands off the door.
But after a fairly short while, they fell into their roles. They became very submissive and dependent, very powerless, and obviously showed signs of stress and anxiety and depression.
Things had gotten so bad that we no longer had a group of prisoners. What we had were individuals believing they were prisoners, struggling for individual survival, no longer caring about their other prisoners or their other fellow students.
Meanwhile, the guards got into their roles, and the level of violence escalated over a period of days. They began to humiliate and degrade the prisoners and find every opportunity to exert their power and influence over the prisoners.
Some of them had prisoners clean out toilet bowls with their bare hands. They now taunt, humiliate, degrade the prisoners in front of each other, and they exert arbitrary control over the prisoners.
This escalation of aggression was so extreme that after a period of 6 days, the experiment had to be brought to a halt before the scheduled time.
I think he showed something that was important at the time, and I think it is about that notion that, because it's not about who you are internally that matters. it's about the social context in which you find yourself.
Zimbardo was wanting to move away from the idea that we can explain extreme behaviour by reference to individual personality characteristics, and wanting to move instead towards an explanation which focused on social structural factors as an explanation for behaviour.
It's about the groups to which you belong and how you take on those group identities and then, in a sense, become them. And I think that's what he showed, and I think that was such a radical way of looking at things at that particular time.
Zimbardo's study had a very important impact on methodological debate, and particularly ethical debate in social psychology at the time. This study really pushed at the boundaries of what people felt was acceptable for social psychologists to do with their participants, and indeed some people felt that he had gone way beyond what was acceptable to do in social psychology experiments. There was therefore considerable debate following this study and a few other very famous studies about the ethics of experimentation in social psychology, and a much tighter scrutiny following this of the sorts of studies which people were conducting and the guidelines which they were using.
Professor Zimbardo's experiment, like any piece of social psychological research, can be examined to see how power relations are played out, and to see how knowledge is situated in its historical and cultural context. It can also be analysed by looking at the role of the individual and society or social groups, and to see how people make choices and show agency, or how social structures determine the outcome of events.
So we have here 3 experiments. One of them is a pure medical experiment, and the 2 other social science experiment. But still, we can learn from the 3 of them about the rules, the ethical rules for conducting experimental research. Now, the Tuskegee experiment clearly show both deception, since the participants were not told about their condition, their situation, and the possibilities to be cured, but also severe harm, including death. The Milgram experiment in 1963, clearly it was based on deception, as the participant did not know what was behind their machine, and the fact that there were no people really to whom electricity was applied to. And also, we can claim that the participants experimented some emotional distress at the very least. And the Zimbardo experiment at Stanford University in 1971, we may claim that there was no deception involved, in the sense of the participants knew what they are getting into, at least at the beginning, but certainly there were, during the experiment, physical harm and also psychological harm, including depression and anxiety. All in all, these experiments and others led people in social science to scrutinize the field of experimental research and to start developing set of ethical rules to be used by social scientists in regards to how to carry out research that involve the participation of other people. During the second half of the 20th century, there have been a number of attempts to respond to unethical research, as we saw in the previous experiments in the documentaries. Now, in the Australian context, in 1966, the National Health and Medical Research Council issued a statement about experimenting with humans based on previous international declaration, and few years later, in 1972, this statement was amended to include social and behavioral research. I think that the most important outcome of these processes is that today, if you work at a university, either if you are a professor or a student or a PhD student doing your ethnographic work or similar, you need to have an ethics approval for your research project, which is given by ethics committees that sit within universities and other research institutions. The process is not simple at all. As the scholar leading the experiment or the ethnographic work that is research that involves human subjects, you will need to explain very carefully all the aspects that involve ethics, have deliberations around your application, and eventually get your approval. In the next couple of slides, we will expand about how these processes work, what are the main components, and the goal is to understand what are the dimensions that a researcher needs to take into account from an ethical point of view when you design a research project. Research ethics have a number of components or dimensions. So let's start to looking into the relevance for research participants. Basically, we must treat our human subjects in the research with respect, strive to protect their welfare as they are engaged in the research, and to protect also their privacy. There are a number of issues we need to take into account, such as confidentiality and anonymity when they give their responses to our questions. When we write in our reports, we should protect the privacy and at all times assure that no information is revealed that can give away their identities. We need also to be aware that participants, people, have a right to refuse to take part in our research project. So they don't need to agree to be participants. Generally, we arrange all these concerns in something that is called informed consent, and I will be explaining about this a bit later. If we are dealing with human subject in our research that for some reason need the consent of a guardian, this should be sought. We need to remember that our method must suit age and other characteristics of our participants. And when we come to our potential participants, we need to disclose what are the research intentions so they understand in which kind of project they are about to engage. Another dimension of research ethics is related to the relationship with a variety of organizations with which we work, or institutions or funding bodies that they give us the appropriate contributions so we can carry out our research. So this means that when we write our reports, we need to acknowledge the not only the institution where we work, but also the funding bodies. And we also need to take into account that if there are any vested interests in funding our research, we should reject that kind of funding, and also take into account the meaning of publication rights when we reach the stage of publishing our findings. So what is informed consent? Informed consent is a voluntary agreement reached between the researchers and the participants. This eventually will lead to a form that is signed by both sides, but in reality this is much more than a form. It is a process through which the participants become aware and understand all the aspects related to the research, and particularly those in which they are involved as participants. This is a crucial and a necessary step before actually starting the research. It means that the researcher must enroll voluntarily the participants. Informed consent must be obtained from all kinds of participants for all types of research, including social sciences. So it involves informing the subject about a range of issues, particularly the rights, what is the purpose of the study, the sort of methods and procedures that they will participate in, and if there are any, the potential risks and also benefits of the participation. The bottom line is that the participants must participate willingly, and vulnerable populations must receive also extra protections. Now, the legal rights of participants may not be waived at any time, and the informed consent agreement must not include any kind of releasing the investigator or the institution in which they work from liability for negligence. Putting all these together, the informed consent form is given to the potential participants, and assuming that they want willingly to participate in the research, they sign the forms, and only then the actual research may start. When one reads through histories of colonialism and settler colonialism, as in Australia, we find that part of these systems of dispossession and exploitation, researchers, European and other white researchers, have been exploiting native communities for their own research. They have made use of the discourses they produce to justify oppression, such as assimilation or racism. They have shown in their practices and research methods lack of respect for native sacred spaces. Some have also been stealing cultural artifacts and silencing the voices of the community, and instead speaking for those communities. So these very problematic practices of white researchers for a long period of time in relation to native communities means that today we conceive research ethics as also including adopting, learning, and understanding the cultural norms and the appropriate behavior that researchers must adopt when they want to research native communities.
A part of that process would be to employ cultural protocols that best suit that particular community. And that's something that individual researchers can do, be they Indigenous researchers or be they non-Indigenous researchers working with reference groups, working with study participants, working with people at the CDU. Cultural protocols is one practical way to show study participants that the research is culturally appropriate and that researchers actually care about that stuff when they go and do the research. It's also very important because of the amount of research that's been done on Indigenous people in the past and today that hasn't incorporated cultural protocols into it. It's a way of making both Indigenous researchers, non-Indigenous researchers and study participants feel comfortable. And there are very simple things that you can do in that process. You can talk to people who are classified as traditional owners of land and make sure that they have an avenue to put forward their perspectives to you as the researcher. You can also do gendered research, in where you'll have male researchers talking to males, females talking to females, etc. and more. And that's very important in all three contexts for the culture of research in the communities, and to allow people the freedom to express themselves in a culturally safe way.
We now move to discuss the relationship between politics and social research. In my view, there is no question that this relationship always exists. The question really is what type of political projects social research is implicated with. We will start by looking into how social research has been implicated during the 20th century in Western countries with war. During World War II, the United States and also Britain and Germany have been using psychologists both to study tactics in psychological warfare and propaganda, and also to study the troops themselves. After World War II, the United States set up a project to study the Russian society, and the CIA had a classified social research on political warfare that was mainly aimed at combating the Soviet bloc. During the 1950s in the United States, the type of research that was associated with war shifted from studying group dynamics and psychological implications of warfare to something that became defined as counterinsurgency studies. Now, not only the military, but more directly also private corporations and universities all became involved in these projects. So we have here a quote from Professor Harry Ackstein that can help us understanding what counterinsurgency studies were about. So it reads, "There is practically no limit to the research that can be and ought to be undertaken on the subject of internal war. In a sense, the study of internal war is commensurate with the whole study of society, even peaceable society, for anything that increases our knowledge of social order can potentially increase our understanding of civil disorder. This quote is from 1962, and what it says is that when Harry Ashton talks about the internal war, it is in fact talking about what happened in society where revolutions or attempts at revolutions or some kind of civil disorder is taking place in places where the United States was not interested in that kind of political change. So the United States believe, this coming together of the military, private corporations and universities in relation to research in war and issues related to war, this ensemble began to deal with how to better understand these processes of political transformation in countries where the United States had economic interest, economic and political interest, and was interested in maintaining existing orders and helping regimes to prevent political change and political transformation. So in other words, social researchers were collaborating from this stage with the military and with the American political establishment to better understand how to prevent that kind of political transformations in countries where the United States had that kind of interest. In 1956, the Special Operations Research Office, or SORO, was created at the American University in Washington. This was the initiative of the military, the U.S. military Army Psychological Office. Now, the aim of this institution was to study social context for what was called counterinsurgency, that we will discuss in the next slide. Counterinsurgency research or studies became a field that attracted many social researchers, from psychologists to sociologists to political scientists, anthropologists, who were interested in collaborating with the United States Army and politics in supporting regimes that were friendly to the American business establishment. This was called as the Mann Doctrine, according to which the United States international politics would adopt a non-intervention attitude towards dictators around the world that were very friendly to the American business, but on the other hand, this doctrine dictated that the United States will help with interventions against processes of political transformations coming from the left in those regimes where there were business interests for the Americans. On the same year that the Mann Doctrine was launched, Project Camelot was put together, 1964. This was a project that was executed by the SORO office at the American University, and it assembled a very eclectic team of social researchers, psychologists, sociologists, anthropologists, economists, and other scholars in the area of social sciences with the aim of helping the United States military to understand better social developments in foreign countries, particularly in Latin America. Eventually, the Project Camelot aroused a certain criticism by professors in South America that and this critique arrived to the United States, and the Department of Defense announced in '65 that they are canceling the project, but in fact the project continued in more discreet ways. Let's have a look at the letter of invitation to scholars, social scientists, to the Project Camelot. So I quote, "Project Camelot is a study whose objective is to determine the feasibility of developing a general social systems model which would make it possible to predict and influence politically significant aspects of social change in the developing nations in the world." So as you see, it states very clearly that the aim of the project is not only to study social change in the developing nations of the world, but also to influence aspects of social change. And then the letter says, first, to devise procedures for assessing the potential for internal war within national societies, which by internal war, they obviously mean processes of political transformation to the left. Then the letter says, second, to identify with increased degrees of confidence those actions which a government might take to relieve conditions which are assessed as giving rise to a potential for internal war. In other words, the project wants to create knowledge to help governments, obviously the governments of the regimes and the government of the United States, interest in intervening in those regimes that can help them preventing those processes of political transformation to the left. And finally, to assess the feasibility of prescribing the characteristics of a system for obtaining and using the essential information for doing the above two things. Now, the letter also stated that the Project Camelot will be funded generously by the United States military, and it spelled out that the first area of the war in which Project Camelot will focus is Latin America. And obviously, in the letter, it says that this kind of action is part of the United States encouraging steady growth and change in the less developed countries in the world. So that's the way that the United States military and the people in charge in Soros defined the sort of interventions that are very well known during the 50s, the 60s, and the 70s by the Americans around the world. So let's look at few examples of the United States international policy under the Mann Doctrine. In 1964, the elected president of Brazil, João Goulart, was forced out of power in a military coup that was backed by the United States. And this happened shortly after Goulart promised a program of land reform and industry nationalization, which would have impact on the United States business interest. On another example, also in Latin America, these three examples are from Latin America. The United States fought politically on the international arena against an indigenous bloc from the Andes Mountains region that were fighting multinational companies related to sugar, mining, and oil. And on a third example, very well known perhaps, the elected president of Chile, Salvador Allende, who was a socialist, was also ousted from power by a military coup that was backed and sponsored by the CIA. The point in this example is not just what happened, the military and intelligence CIA interventions of the Americans in the around the world, but the fact that social scientists were recruited into projects in the US military and the CIA to help these interventions to happen. This is what we need to look at, the relation of social scientists in projects, the involvement of social scientists in projects that were part and parcel of international doctrine that was all about intervening in other countries' politics and regimes. Another example of the American intervention following the Mann Doctrine and in which social scientists were involved is the story of counterinsurgency in Thailand. In 1965, the Thai Communist Party launched a guerrilla against the military dictatorship in Thailand, whereas the American government supported the Thai government, that is the military dictatorship. In that occasion was also recruitment of social scientists to help understanding how to prevent the Communist Party in Thailand from recruiting more and more Thai people into the insurgent action of the Thai Communist Party. As I commented before, there was some critique arising against Project Camelot and similar projects coming from the targeted countries, but also in the United States, that kind of critique began during the mid-60s, particularly 65 and beyond. And the anthropologists were those who led the critique against this type of scholarly intervention. And they also passed a resolution at the American Anthropological Association stating that they are against participating in clandestine intelligence activities. And they also changed the ethical code for anthropologists following this critique. But the problem overall is that the United States scholarly community did not contest the validity of working with the government and the military in the analysis of other societies with the goal of helping the government to change the regimes of those societies. Fast-tracking about 30 years, I want to discuss now the human terrain system, which was announced in 2006 and about 10 years later closed. This was the most expensive program funded by the US military, in which social scientists were implicated. The architecture of this program was to recruit anthropologists mainly, but also other social scientists that can be able to provide what they call cultural knowledge, so as to better serve counterinsurgency work of the Americans in the occupied Iraq and Afghanistan. The idea was to embed within combat units teams of scientists which will follow the combat units and gather information on the occupied people in Iraq, in Afghanistan. And at its peak, the Human Terrain System employed more than 500 social scientists. And its principal designer was anthropologist Montgomery McFate. Part of the Human Terrain System operations was to launch a special counterinsurgency manual. We have here 3 articles from within this manual for you to have an idea how the military, in cooperation with social scientists, rationalize their intervention in the occupied Iraq and Afghanistan. So, for instance, in Article 180, they say cultural knowledge is essential to waging a successful counterinsurgency. You see that there are no mistakes here in the sense of how the military, in fact, how social scientists have recruited themselves into a political project of invasion and occupation of another countries, putting their knowledge and their expertise at the service of that kind of politics. So in the same article 180, they talk about the fact that American ideas of what is normal or rational are not universal. To the contrary, members of other societies often have different notions of rationality, appropriate behaviors, so on and so forth. So this is interesting. The manual is internalizing what we call generally, cultural difference, and the fact that one cannot claim that the whole universe, the whole planet behaves in the same way. And they are using these ideas to better understand how the local populations that the US military is occupying should be studied, and what can be learned from them in order to shape better counter insurgency operations. In 350, they say the most important cultural form of for counterinsurgents to understand is the narrative, a story recounted in the form of a causally linked set of events that explains an event in a group's history and expresses the values, character, and so on and so forth. So they are calling their soldiers, their commanders, with the help of the social scientists that were accompanying them to better understand the populations that they immerse themselves as part of the military occupation, and again, in order to conduct a particular politics in those areas dictated by the US government. Again, this is a very strong example of how social scientists are recruited into particular political projects. People from within the American academic community and also investigative journalists began publishing that social scientists were involved in intelligence gathering and data collection in Iraq and Afghanistan. The critiques argued that this kind of social scientist activities is utterly unethical because it turns academics into informants and spies, that their actions can cause harm to Iraqi and Afghan civilians, and also because it delegitimizes the social science disciplines. On the other hand, the human terrain system supporters claim that social scientists were not involved in that kind of activity, but also only in producing more cultural understanding with the occupied populations that may help reducing casualties. There were inquiries in the US Congress, and eventually in 2015 the human terrain system was shut down. I have been focusing so far mainly in the relation of social scientists to war-related work in the United States, but obviously this happens all over the world. Another example is the State of Israel and how the academia helps supporting the settled colonial domination of the Palestinian people. The involvement of Israeli academics in the universities and research centers of the settled colonial project takes place mainly in joint projects with the military, developing a wide range of war technologies, but not only. There are also forms of cooperation between universities and companies developing weapons such as Elbit and Rafael in Israel. There is also participation in forms of Israeli military training via degrees in universities on security studies, involvement of academics in military colleges, and also by offering academic programs and degrees for the Israeli General Security Service. There is also direct and indirect involvement of academics and universities with the Israeli occupation in the West Bank and Gaza. We also know that there are high-ranking military officers in Israel University performing as lecturers and researchers. And there are other forms of university and the academic community involvement with Israel's settled colonialism, either by way of discriminating Palestinian students or trying to shut down political dissent against the Israeli occupation within the Israeli universities. Well, we have arrived now to the end of this lecture, in which we have discussed various aspects and dimensions of ethics in research and also of politics in research.